So if you'll allow me to, I'm actually going to try to show some maps here. Are you seeing this? Is it okay? So very good. And my apologies to all the various places from which I have borrowed, I hope in fair use, their copyrighted works. When we're talking about the legal status of the territory of what most of the world calls the West Bank, and I think that's what we're talking about today, we're talking about a very tiny piece of territory. You can see over here a map that I borrowed from BICOM that shows a comparison of the state of Israel, inclusive of the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights, compared to England, Scotland, and Wales. And as you can see, we are not talking about a very large piece of territory. The West Bank is what looks like a face with an open mouth of some kind in the darker blue of the state of Israel. It's not a very large piece of territory. But as Natasha, as you said, this tends to be an issue where there's an inverse proportion between light and heat. And there's a lot of heat, and so not much light. To understand the legal status of the territory forces us to actually take a step back in history. The last point in time where everyone agreed about the legal status of the territory, about who had sovereignty, is 100 years ago, when it was more than 100 years ago, when it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. As you can see, the Ottoman Empire then controlled a substantial chunk of the Middle East. It lost control of that territory during World War I. And what the victors did, Britain and France in particular, they divided up this territory not as parts of their empire, but they created, together with the other allied nations, an entirely new form of legal organization of territory. It was called a mandate. And now I will say that there was one piece of the mandate for Palestine that was special, and it does play a role in understanding the legal situation, and that is that the mandate was issued by the Allied States and approved by the League of Nations after Britain had issued the Balfour Declaration favoring the reestablishment of the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that Balfour Declaration was incorporated within the mandate. It was within the terms of the mandate as they were approved first by the Allied nations in San Remo in 1920, and then thereafter as they were approved by the League of Nations in 1922. And they very clearly charged Britain with reestablishing the ancient Jewish homeland in the state of Palestine. There was only one exception to this. The Brits were permitted to exclude from the Jewish national home the Transjordanian parts of the mandate. That would be what today we know as the state of Jordan. But there was no such restriction to the eastern part, sorry, to the western part of the mandate, that is what we would call today Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land. Here we get into very problematic terminology. Now, the mandate for Palestine was functionally divided for most of its history between the Transjordanian part and the Cisjordanian part, the western part, which was the part designated for the Jewish homeland. And it was actually legally divided in 1946 when Britain recognized the independence of a state of Transjordan east of the river. And that meant that in 1948, the mandate of Palestine looked like this. It incorporated all of what today we refer to separately as the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, or as it was referred to then, Judea and Samaria. And there was no distinction within the mandate among those territories. Britain, as the 40s went on after World War II, got in increasing trouble over the mandate, primarily because the British were refusing to admit Jewish immigrants, even though they were required to do so by the terms of the mandate. And they were refusing to do so even after it became clear that, that Nazi Germany had murdered 3/4 of the Jewish population of Europe, and Britain was refusing to admit the refugees. In 1948, Britain, after consulting with the United Nations, getting a recommendation and refusing to implement it, Britain simply walked away. That was the last legal boundary that was established for this territory. Following the war, there were ceasefire agreements. When Britain left, the Arabs invaded Transjordan, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, all invaded and grabbed what they could grab from the territory. There's a second war in 1956 and a third war in 1967. In 1967, Israel managed to push back the invaders from 1948 and beyond. And so Israel not only took back Judea and Samaria, which Transjordan had since renamed the West Bank, along with renaming itself from Transjordan to Jordan. Israel also managed to capture Egyptian territory, the Sinai Peninsula, and Syrian territory, the Golan Heights. But all these were simply ceasefire agreements. These were captured. It was captured by Jordan, captured by Egypt, and then captured by Israel without anyone agreeing to a transfer of sovereignty. Now, more recently, Israel reached a series of agreements with the PLO during the 1990s to divide up administrative control of the West Bank and Gaza, and create a new Palestinian Authority that would control the affairs of Palestinians in that area. They agreed that part of the land, what we would call today parts A and B, or areas A and B of the West Bank, would be under the territorial control of the PLO, whereas the rest of it, Area C, which is the blue portion here, and roughly 60% of the West Bank, would be under Israeli territorial control. But the PLO Israel agreements said explicitly that they did not address issues of ultimate sovereignty, that was left open for final status negotiations between the party, and in the meantime, everybody preserved their positions. So we have a history going back to 100 years. We have an agreement that the Ottoman Empire had sovereignty during World War I, and we know that mandates were created from it since then. And after the end of the mandate in 1948, we have no agreement. There were wars. Possession over the territory changed hands without a solid agreement as to sovereignty over the West Bank. So whose is it? And here, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to use this slide, even though it's not a map. Here are the possibilities. The general doctrine by which international law determines who has sovereignty over territory when a new state is formed, or in particular when a new state is formed out of former colonial possessions, including mandates. The general rule is what the Latin phrase is uti possidetis iuris, but the rule is that the new state incorporates all of the territory of the previous administrative unit. This is, for example, why most states in the world believe that the Ukraine still has sovereignty over the Crimea, even though Russia captured possession in a very brief conflict. And that's because that territory, Crimea, was part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at the moment when the Ukraine became an independent state. And so the Ukraine succeeded to the entirety of the legal territory of that administrative unit of the Soviet Union. And if that's the rule that we use, and that is the rule that's used elsewhere in the world, then it's fairly clear that since 1948, Israel has had territorial sovereignty over all of the mandate of Palestine, including the West Bank including East Jerusalem and including the Gaza Strip. Now, there's another argument that can be raised regarding the territory, which is, well, maybe we should set aside the general rule of uti possidetis juris and respect the rights of self-determination of the peoples involved. Now, there are two peoples involved here, the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. The Palestinians often claim title on the basis of their right to self-determination. That's not generally the way these things work in international law. In international law, uti possidetis juris is generally seen to trump self-determination. But the Palestinians nevertheless claim title on the basis of self-determination. There's an interesting flaw with this argument, which is the mandate over Palestine specifically gave rights to the Jewish people to reconstitute their ancient homeland. And in general, it's understood that mandates were vindications of the rights of self-determination of specific peoples, which means that as strong as the Palestinian right of self-determination is, there's a prior right of self-determination of the Jewish people, which was endorsed in the mandate for Palestine and then given continued force after the mandate by Article 80 of the UN Charter. Now, there's a third argument that's often raised regarding this territory, which is that it's not acceptable these days, or at least most legal academics and scholars and practitioners believe that these days military conquest does not give states title to land. Now, this is an argument that's often used regarding Israel and the West Bank. It's claimed that Israel can't claim title by virtue of its conquest in 1967. And I suppose that's fair enough, although it's also true that neither Jordan nor the Palestinians can claim title by virtue of Jordan's conquest in 1948. If we throw out the conquest, we're left once again with the situation as it was in 1948, and that is that Israel succeeded to title to sovereignty by virtue of the doctrine of uti possidetis juris. Now, it's a possible argument that one of the other sides has acquiesced or abandoned its claim. Perhaps Israel gave up its claim. But if you look through the agreements, you'll see that Israel has never done so. It's possible to get to an agreement to change the borders, but if you look through the chain of agreements, Israel has a border agreement with Jordan. It has a border agreement with Egypt, but the border agreement with Jordan does not address the question of sovereignty in the West Bank, and Israel's agreement with the PLO likewise does not address it. Israel and the PLO may reach an agreement in the future, but at least to date, there hasn't been a change of sovereignty. And of course, then you have the last argument. The argument is not really one of international law, but it's the one that's most popularly raised. It's often said that the international community has decided that the West Bank is occupied Palestinian territory, or that it's sovereign territory of the state of Palestine. And it may very well be true. I haven't seen polls on the subject, but I presume, based on what I see in the media, that most of the international community, which I presume means most of Europe, believes that the Palestinians have sovereignty, or the right to sovereignty over the West Bank. Now, that's a very interesting point. It's not a point of international law. International law does not recognize awarding title by popularity contest. So if you look through these factors, I think that it's fairly clear that under international law, Israel has title. It's title that Israel can agree to surrender, and Israel's negotiated over in the past and may yet agree to surrender in the future. But until that changes, it seems to me fairly clear that Israel has sovereign title under international law over the disputed West Bank and East Jerusalem.